Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be discussing Gaza in Crisis by Noam Chomsky and Ilan Pappe. If you watched my previous review on Palestine featuring these two gentlemen as well, this is the prequel to that book. So that book came some years later. This book was occasioned by Operation Cast Lead in 2006, and it led to Frank, the editor who's bringing these two people together, to come up with the idea of I'd feature some essays from Pappe, some essays from Chomsky, individual interview with each of them, and then an interview with the both of them. And what I find just as interesting in this text as I did in the other one is the differences of opinion that Pappe and Chomsky have, despite sharing many of the same assumptions, that they can come to different conclusions and advocate for different ideas. And to see that laid out only helps other people think through their ideas more concretely, because they can see two very educated people on these issues look at things differently. And I think that's helpful. So also, if you've been following what's been going on since October the 7th of last year, 2023, you'll understand that both Operation Cast Lead and Operation Protective Edge were but the sneakest of sneak previews in relation to the murder, the death, the destruction, the mayhem that has been rained down by the IDF on innocent Palestinian civilians, women, children, in a way that we've never seen before. And in a sense has put the Palestinian issue in the front of people's minds that books like this and even on Palestine weren't able to do. So whether that's good or not is something that we'll have to examine some time from now, is to see, as they say, as Pappe points out in the text, attitude doesn't matter so much unless it's translated into action. So what is the action is going to translate from what we've seen so much, the protests, etc., in the past few months? It remains to be seen. But let's hear from Professors Chomsky and Pappe. So this is Professor Chomsky talking about the two-state solution, as some people put it. The U.S. and Israel can pursue the project with international backing unless Hamas meets the three conditions imposed by the, quote, international community, a technical term referring to the U.S. government and whoever goes along with it. For Palestinians to be permitted to peek out of the walls of their Gaza dungeon, Hamas must first recognize Israel, or in a more extreme form, Israel's right to exist, that is, the legitimacy of Palestinians' expulsion from their homes. Secondly, renounce violence. Thirdly, accept past agreements, in particular, the roadmap of the quartet. The hypocrisy again is stunning. No such conditions are imposed on those who wear the jackboots. Firstly, Israel does not recognize Palestine, in fact, is devoting extensive efforts to ensure that there will be no viable Palestine ever, always with decisive U.S. support. Israel does not renounce violence, and it is ridiculous even to raise the question with regard to the United States. Israel firmly rejects past agreements, in particular the roadmap, with U.S. support. The first 2 points are obvious. The third is correct, but scarcely known. While Israel formally accepted the roadmap, it attached 14 reservations that completely eviscerate it. And this was something that was covered in Jimmy Carter's Palestine Peace Not Apartheid. I'll put a link to that, a card up there, so if you'd like to go back and hear about some of those objections. To take just the first, Israel demanded that for the process to commence and continue, the Palestinians must first ensure full quiet, education for peace, cessation of incitement, dismantling of Hamas and other organizations, and other conditions. And even if they were to satisfy this virtually impossible demand, the Israeli cabinet proclaimed that the roadmap will not state that Israel must cease violence and incitement against the Palestinians. The other reservations continue in the same vein. So Palestinians must cease violence against the Israelis, but the Israelis, they do not need to cease violence against the Palestinians. What a crazy idea. Here's just some helpful statistics. Since 1949, the United States has passed to Israel more than $100 billion in grants and $10 billion in special loans. Other bodies not part of the administration annually transfer to Israel $1 billion. This is larger than the amount of money transferred by the United States to North Africa, South America, and the Caribbean put together. Because remember, all of those peoples, they're less important than the Israelis. Their joint population amounts to over 1 billion people. Israel's population is 7 million. Over the last 20 years, $5.5 billion has been given to Israel for military purchases. There is no precedent for such bilateral relations, and one does not have to overstate the implications of such a policy for the Palestinians and for the chances of peace in the Middle East. And where do those weapons get purchased from? I'll give you one possible answer. I suggest, let's see, who is this coming from? This is from Pappe. I suggest, however, that the events that unfolded after May 1948 in Israel and Palestine should be reviewed from within the paradigm of ethnic cleansing, rather than as part of military history. Historiographically, this would mean that the deeds perpetrated were part of the domestic policies implemented by a regime vis-a-vis civilians. In many cases, given the fact that the ethnic cleansing took place within the designated UN Jewish state, and also that most of the first wave of expulsions happened prior to Israel's declaration of independence in May, these were operations conducted by a regime against its own citizens. I think this is something people don't realize. These civilians did not, quote unquote, go to war with the Israelis. They were expelled as civilians and as ostensible citizens of the new Jewish state. The Jews did not want any Palestinians in their state. Whatever they told you before, their actions told you what they really thought. The ethnic cleansing paradigm also explains why expulsions rather than massacres were of the essence of such crimes. As emerges from the evidence of the Balkan Wars of the 1990s, within the general pattern of ethnic cleansing, the sporadic massacres perpetrated were more motivated by revenge than the acting out of a clear-cut plan. However, the scheme to create new ethnic realities was facilitated by these massacres, no less than if they had been the result of a policy of systematic expulsion. This is from an essay by Chomsky called Exterminate All the Brutes, Gaza, 2009. So here he's quoting Middle East specialist Fawaz Gerges. Gerges believes that U.S.-Israeli state terror will fail. Hamas, he writes, cannot be wiped out without massacring 500,000 Palestinians. If Israel succeeds in killing Hamas's senior leaders, a new generation, more radical than the present, will swiftly replace them. Hamas is a fact of life. It is not going away, and it will not raise the white flag regardless of how many casualties it suffers. Hamas is regularly described as Iranian-backed Hamas, which is dedicated to the destruction of Israel. One will be hard put to find something like democratically elected Hamas, which has long been calling for a two-state settlement in accord with the international consensus, blocked for more than 30 years by the United States and Israel. It's all true, but not a useful contribution to the party line, and hence dispensable. Can you imagine people saying democratically elected Hamas? In the most free election in the Middle East, presided over by Jimmy Carter and other international observers, widely noted as a free and fair election. And how do people get treated for participating in this great precedent of democratic election in the Middle East? They get put under a blockade because they voted the wrong way. These devices, and he's here talking about different ways that the occupation in the West Bank has divided up Palestinian land. These devices, which have roots in the pre-state period, trace back to the earliest days of the occupation, when the basic idea was formulated poetically by Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, who was in charge of the occupied territories. The situation today resembles the complex relationship between a Bedouin man and the girl he kidnaps against his will. You, Palestinians, as a nation, don't want us today, but we'll change your attitude by forcing our presence on you. You will live like dogs, and whoever will leave, while we take what we want. I'm just reading what the Israelis are telling us. I believe them. Today, Israel could have security, normalization of relations, and integration into the region. But it very clearly prefers illegal expansion, conflict, and repeated exercise of violence, actions that are not only criminal, murderous, and destructive, but are also eroding its own long-term security. It's not only not good for the region, it's not even good for Israel. Israel is not acting in its own interests. It's acting in a totally irrational manner. This hegemonic, this is from Ilan Pappe's essay, Blueprint for a One-State Movement. This hegemonic American-Israeli presence produced 5 guidelines that so far have not been challenged politically and diplomatically by the quartet and whoever manages the peace process and all the histrionics around it. The first guideline relates directly to the struggle over historic memory mentioned above. It states the, quote, conflict began in 1967, and hence the essence of its solution is an agreement that would determine only the future status of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Such a perspective confines a settlement to 78% of Palestine, so ignoring 1948. The second guideline is that everything visible in those areas is divisible, and that such divisibility is the key for peace. So even the remaining 22% of Palestine has to be divided for the sake of peace. Moreover, the peace agenda meant that not only the 1967 occupied areas should be divided, but also its people and natural resources. The third guideline is that anything that happened until 1967, including the consequences of the Nakba and its ethnic cleansing, are not negotiable. This pushed the refugee issue off the agenda, where it remains to this very day. The fourth guideline is an equation between the end of the Israeli occupation and the end of the conflict. Namely, once some kind of eviction or control were agreed upon, the conflict would be resolved for all intents and purposes. The last guideline is that Israel is not committed to any concession until the Palestinian armed struggle ends. And of course, these conditions led to the disasters of Oslo, which we can talk about in some future video. So here Chomsky is answering a question about U.S. politics, presidential elections, and the Israel lobby. It is not the lobby that induces major U.S. high-tech corporations to increase their investments in Israel, or that leads the U.S. military and intelligence to strengthen their relations with Israel and to pre-position weapons in Israel for U.S. intervention in the region. The lobby indeed has influence, but typically when it pursues goals that are of little concern to U.S. elite opinion and concentrations of power, like crushing Palestinians. When U.S. power rejects its goals, the lobby disappears. In fact, an important example occurred just at the time when Obama and McCain were disgracing themselves by their oaths to Israel. AIPAC was strongly supporting a congressional resolution, H.R. 362, calling for a virtual blockade of Iran, an act of war. They had mustered considerable congressional support, but the resolution vanished when the administration made it clear, quietly, that it opposed the resolution. Anti-war lobbyists also had some effect. So, if America were to ever have the backbone to put its foot down, it could stop almost all of what's going on. Again, this is Chomsky. Israel assumes, let me read the prelude to that. For decades, Israel has been hijacking boats in international waters between Cyprus and Lebanon, killing or kidnapping passengers, sometimes bringing them to prisons in Israel, including secret prison torture chambers, sometimes holding them as hostages for many years. Israel assumes that it can carry out such crimes with impunity because the United States tolerates them and Europe generally follows the U.S. lead. Much the same is true of Israel's pretext for its latest crime, that the Freedom Flotilla was bringing materials that could be used for bunkers for rockets. Putting aside the absurdity, if Israel were interested in stopping Hamas rockets, it knows exactly how to proceed. Accept Hamas offers for a ceasefire. In June 2008, Israel and Hamas reached a ceasefire agreement. The Israeli government formally acknowledges that until Israel broke the agreement on November the 4th, invading Gaza and killing half a dozen Hamas activists, Hamas did not fire a single rocket. Hamas offered to renew the ceasefire. The Israeli cabinet considered the offer and rejected it, preferring to launch its murderous and destructive operation Cast Lead on December the 27th. So, as always, if you enjoyed this review, hit like, subscribe, share this with people who you think would benefit from hearing some of these voices. If you'd like to buy the book itself, there'll be a link in the description. That's one way you can support this channel. Another way would be by joining my Patreon or the YouTube members group. You'll get early releases of these videos and also have a chance to talk to me about production, suggest books for future reviews, and talk with other members in the community as well. You can also pick from my Amazon wish list, which is linked below, and suggest books for 2025. In 2024, my focus is on the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. So a portion of any of these proceeds will go to them this year. If you don't know about them, there's a link in the description. You can go visit their site, consider contributing to them directly. But they will, if you want to support them indirectly by supporting my channel, you can do so. You'll be able to help Palestinian children get medical relief that they would not otherwise be able to receive. As always, enjoy your reading.